Let's chat about Nate Pond, who I had the honor of meeting back in, I believe, 1976. And we had a lot of time to chat, especially at Mike's place in Orange, because I learned very quickly that we learned more about skydiving at the bar at the end of the day than we do running around the drop zone most of the time. At least that's how it was in the early days. That's where all the coaching happened, right? He told me about the round canopy modification called the Gary Gore modification. It turns out when Nate's working in the rigging loft and he's got little son Gary, who's about, I don't know, 4 or 5 years old, well, they kind of left him alone in the corner. When they finally go over and see Gary, he's got a pair of scissors in his hand and he's chopping up on a parachute. So Nate kind of freaked out and kind of like took the scissors away, and then he threw the canopy up on the table to see how much damage Gary created. And then he noticed that all the cuts happened on the back end of the canopy, and all the panels that were cut willy-nilly were kind of in a symmetrical location. So Nate looked at that, cut out all the sections, and then hung it up, and he goes, this thing might actually work. He says the drive slots are about where they would need to be to give that canopy some forward speed. He says, let's go give it a jump. Well, it worked, and the Gary Gore modification was born. Another neat story was, and I cornered Nate, and it took a while for him to tell the story, so I'll give you the brief synopsis. I asked him, how did you guys end up in Orange? How did you hook up with Jacques Estelle? Well, he gave me the history on it, and I'm going to try to give it back to you as best as my terrible memory can recall. But Nate and his family lived in a small farm, I believe, in Waterford, Connecticut, and they had their own small aircraft on a small grass strip. And I believe Nate had said that they had all made their first jump. His dad and his brother had made their first jump because they met an old Army parachute rigger who had some old parachute equipment. He was a rigger. He was never a jumper himself, but he says, I can teach you how to make a jump. And sure enough, they all progressed and made a static line jump apiece, okay, on their farm. Sometime later, a year or two later, they're reading the newspaper one Sunday, and they read an article, or just an advertisement, and it's Jacques Estelle placed an ad in there. He says, I'm looking to open a parachute center in the United States, and I'm looking for a piece of property in a small airport to do this on. If you have an interest, contact me. Well, Nate saw that, and he goes, Dad, what do you think? You know, I'll give the guy a call. What does it hurt? So they got a hold of Jacques. Jacques came out and visited their farm. He goes, it's kind of small, not exactly what I have in mind. He had these big grandiose plans of opening up a big modern parachute center, which at that time didn't even exist other than a military training center. And Jacques was free fall qualified, probably one of the more prominent parachutists at that particular time in France. So they traveled around, fell upon Orange, Mass, big municipal airport there, big triangular shaped runways from World War II, and boom, Orange came about. Somehow in that mix, Lou Sanborn got in there, and of course, those were the 3 guys that started the Orange Parachute Center. And that's where I made my first jump. So there we have Jacques Estelle, Lou Sanborn, and Nate Pond all coming together. And then the story about when everybody qualified, Parachute Club of America was going to start issuing expert licenses, and those 3, Jacques, Lou, and Nate, were the only ones to qualify for the expert license. And because it was an introductory thing, they're going, well, who's going to be D1, who's going to be D2, and so on. Well, they flipped a coin. Lou won out, got D1 from, this is Nate's story to me, and Jacques won the next toss. He got D2, and Nate says, well, I don't want D3. He says, I want D69. and that's where that went, you know. And years later, his son, Gary Pond, when he qualified for his D license, he called up Bill Otley at USPA and says, is there any chance, I'm looking at the D license numbers and they're coming up on D6969. I would love to get that number because my dad's got number 69. And sure enough, Gary ended up with D6969. And that was the story how I remembered it. Cut.